just educating the public on nuclear technology or telling them about it doesn't really increase sympathy for the technology. People really need to be involved in the process.
Welcome to another episode of Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I'm Alex Trembath, your host and deputy director here at Breakthrough. For this episode, I spoke with Lenka Kollar. Lenka is the director of strategy and external relations at NuScale Power, a company that is commercializing a small modular nuclear reactor for deployment later this decade. NewScale is widely considered the farthest along of many advanced nuclear companies, and Lenka and I talk about what that means in this episode. We also talk about what makes the advanced nuclear industry different from conventional nuclear, the need to engage customers and the general public, and the reception of advanced nuclear by the broader clean tech community. Lenka Kollar, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Alex.
So NewScale, the company that you work at, it's an advanced nuclear technology company. And I would say it's largely considered to be the, quote, farthest along, unquote, of the many advanced nuclear companies and technologies. So can you tell us about the reactor, about the company, and what farthest along means?
Sure. So like you said, I'm the director of strategy and external relations at NuScale Power, and we are designing a small modular reactor. And I actually have to even correct myself here because we're now no longer just designing it, we're commercializing it now. And that's what you mean by furthest along. And when I think back, I was in college about 10 years ago. Right when I graduated, there was a lot of excitement in the nuclear industry for new large reactors being built in the United States and around the world. And I had heard of NuScale, but at that point, it was still very much a university startup project that started at Oregon State University. And they were just starting to get funding and later on went through the pre-application process with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And then when I started at NuScale about 4 years ago was when we submitted the license application to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC. And what that means is that the NRC spends time, a lot of hours. We're estimating now 270,000 hours have been spent or are going to be spent by the end of this application review process. And no other advanced nuclear company in the US has yet gone through that process. So fast forward to now, we're almost finished with that technical review. The NRC has looked at our technology in a lot of depth and approved many of the things that we set out to prove in the nuclear industry in terms of improving safety systems to be inherently safe, improving the design to be simpler and smarter. And so we're the furthest along in terms of that regulatory process, and therefore that has brought us very close to that commercialization stage.
Yeah, so we're talking about commercialization. Do you have a sense of where your reactors will be deployed or in what context or sort of what hole in the energy system that NuScale is looking to fill?
Sure. Our first plant is going to be with the Utah Associated Municipal Power Systems, UAMPS. They're a collection of small municipal utilities headquartered in Utah, but they're across the western states. And they currently buy power from a lot of coal assets, and those plants are retiring for a variety of reasons. They're not economic anymore because of environmental regulations, or simply they're just too old to continue operating. So they're seeing a lot of power come offline, and at the same time wanting to invest in carbon-free power. And so they've embarked on a carbon-free power project that includes energy efficiency programs, rooftop solar for their community members, as well as investing in wind power plants. And the largest piece of that is the NuScale technology. So they're going to build this power plant in Idaho on the site of the Idaho National Laboratory. We estimate that the first module in that plant will be in commercial operation by 2026.
So you're talking about the ways the different sort of clean energy technologies fit together, which I do want to get back to. But before I get there, you also mentioned, sort of, 10 years back or when you were early on paying attention to these things, that we were talking a lot more about building maybe updated but conventional larger nuclear reactors, harkening back to 10, 15 years ago, lots of conversations about a nuclear renaissance. And there was actually a good amount of not just policy and investment from the 2006 energy bill and elsewhere in that conversation, but there were projects, right? We were and sort of in various ways kind of still are building reactors in Georgia and South Carolina. So from NewScale's perspective and your perspective, what went wrong there? Why didn't that work out?
What went wrong with large nuclear? I think first and foremost, the financial crisis hit right when I was graduating. And these large nuclear power plants require a lot of capital investment. And there was a time where we saw our energy demand going up quite a bit. So it was the combination of the financial crisis and people not really being willing to invest in large infrastructure projects, as well as the proliferation of fracking, I think is another thing. Natural gas became really cheap. And so the need for large baseload nuclear just wasn't there anymore. And add to that effect the continued growth of renewables and the energy price of renewables coming down. So we had a few different factors that I think contributed to these large nuclear projects not really going forward as they were imagined when I was graduating.
But even with all of those factors weighing against them, the sort of development and construction of these projects has not gone well.
Yeah, I think especially in the US and Europe, we've seen a lot of the large nuclear power plants really just be over time and over budget, and therefore the financial community doesn't have a lot of confidence in these projects being built on time and on budget. So we've been looking at how these projects have gone and trying not to make the same mistakes as we move forward with our own commercialization process. So really looking at the things that went wrong, the lessons learned. And one of those is the supply chain, for example. So we are already preparing our supply chain to be able to manufacture the NuScale modules. And that's starting with manufacturing trials this year, for example, before we even pursue the initial construction on the project. So we are looking at this and wanting to have a power plant that is not only built on time and on budget, but far more cost-effective and a smaller capital investment than the large nuclear reactors. And this is what's opened up the ability for our project to be bought by municipal utilities and not necessarily a large investor-owned utility. So this is a change in the business model for nuclear.
You mentioned manufacturing. You mentioned consideration of supply chain. So what else makes advanced nuclear and NuScale within it different from the conventional approach to supply chain construction, project development? How is the advanced nuclear industry thinking differently about getting reactors actually built and generating electricity?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that make the advanced reactor, I would say, community different. And I say community because the first thing that makes it different is the people and the companies that are actually going forward with these advanced reactor designs. So while there still are the traditional nuclear companies that are investing in advanced reactor designs, our company, NewScale, for example, came from a university project that a professor developed and then decided to form a company to commercialize. So this is a different set of people than what have been involved in nuclear development before. And we're even seeing startups in the Bay Area, for example, that are getting investment from venture capitalists. So this is, again, a different model than nuclear has had before in terms of needing very large investments and very strong government support. Although we do still get strong government support from the Department of Energy, the people were more of a startup company than in the past that nuclear has had. Another thing that's different is the designs themselves. We used to design nuclear power plants to be as big as possible and then kind of add the safety systems on. And the way we've thought about the technology is that safety should be inherent to the design, and it should be as simple as possible, because the simpler something is, the less likely it is to break. It's very simple engineering from that aspect.
So we're talking smaller reactors, inherent passive safety features, a different size and style of companies. You mentioned policy, and that there still are sort of policy needs of the industry. I imagine those are quite different from the policy needs of conventional reactors or larger construction projects. What are those? What are the types of policy that are either active or that are needed to accelerate the commercialization of technologies like yours?
There's a few different things in terms of policy. First of all, there's a lot of assets that we have within the Department of Energy and the national labs. A lot of these advanced nuclear designs have been developed before. Even our SMR technology, while it's an advanced concept, it's not something that's completely new and has never been thought of before. And so taking these designs that have been researched in the past and actually commercializing them is the model we need to pursue today. And with that, you still need government support to open up the facilities of the national laboratories to be able to be used by commercial companies. And also, there's other things that can incentivize the development of new nuclear, and that includes things like tax credits. And then there's things that can be done also on the state and community level. So, for example, there's a lot of local areas that are setting 100% renewable energy goals, and we should make sure that those are inclusive of all clean technologies so that they include, anything else that could be coming down the pipeline, not just wind and solar, but other renewable technologies, nuclear energy, so that these can be included in the goals that people are setting.
So, as we have our own perspective on a bunch of these issues. We released a report 2 years ago, I want to say, called "How to Make Nuclear Innovative," where we looked at innovation success stories in other industries, and we looked at biotech and pharma, we looked at commercial aviation, we looked at fracking. So I'm curious, what are the industries and technologies that NewScale looks to for examples of successful innovation, for examples of helpful regulatory platforms that sort of accelerate instead of hindering innovation? Are there examples of technologies or companies or industries that you find inspiring, or that you find would be a good analog for advanced nuclear?
Yeah, I think you already mentioned it. The aviation industry is a perfect example of something the nuclear industry can benchmark, because it's also an industry that has very high tech and needs to have stringent safety standards. Let me give you an example of that, and that is the operating control room that we have. It will need to operate 12 reactors from one control room, which hasn't been done before in the nuclear industry. But an example of where that is done is air traffic control towers. And they use a lot of human factors engineering in order to be able to operate, multiple things going on in one room. And so we've been able to benchmark them to have innovations in the way we design our control room so that it is simple to operate and very straightforward. Another example from the aviation industry is also how they do licensing and regulation on an international level. So obviously there's lots of planes that go from one country to another. So from the very beginning, the aviation industry had to have international licensing practices. And we have something similar to that in nuclear in terms of safety standards that are well accepted by the international community, but they're done on a voluntary basis and not necessarily on a regulatory basis internationally. So, for example, it would be great if I described the design certification that we're pursuing with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the US. It would be great if that design certification were very similar to what other countries require in terms of safety standards, and that we could use that one stamp to then go and export to other countries our technology. And they would still regulate the operations and the site selection, but the design certification itself could be just certified by one agency.
So in largely the same amount of time that the advanced nuclear industry has sort of cropped up over the, sort of the last decade, as you say, Breakthrough has been in our own journey much more in the environmental NGO side of things. We were one of the first environmental NGOs to come out very strongly in favor of nuclear as a climate solution, and have gravitated ourselves, obviously, towards advanced nuclear as more specifically as a really important technology for climate and other environmental problems. And that has been, as you know full well, quite a journey for us, as we have seen other organizations make their own evolutions in the environmental space. Lots of debates about the sort of safety of existing reactors, the need for policies to keep them online or not, the reaction to policies like Germany's Energiewende, and California's decision to shut down Diablo Canyon, for instance, as well as policies that you were referencing at the national level, like support for advanced nuclear from the Department of Energy. So that it's been sort of quite a decade from our side of things, dealing with a lot of the analysis and advocacy communities around energy and climate and clean energy technology. I'm particularly curious to ask you about the sort of clean tech industry and the clean tech community. Advanced nuclear is quickly becoming sort of a clean energy technology, much like others. But there are still, I gather, some tensions. I don't know if that's the right word, or at least some newness to advanced nuclear technologies and advanced nuclear companies in the way that there aren't as much around renewable energy technologies, solar, wind, whatever. So I'm curious your perspective from industry. What is your perception of, or sort of what is your sense of the clean tech community and how nuclear and advanced nuclear fit into it?
Yeah, before I answer that, I actually remember the Breakthrough Institute from 10 years ago. Ted Nordhaus came to Department of Energy headquarters, and it was my first job out of college, and came to talk to us. And I was like, who is this environmental organization from California supporting nuclear? So I was really impressed with that. And it had me follow you guys, for the last decade. And I think what I've seen since then is that there is a much broader acceptance among the environmental clean tech community in the last few years that nuclear has to be a part of the climate change mitigation solution. But I wouldn't say that that's mainstream yet. So I'm going to a clean tech forum this week and speaking on an advanced nuclear panel, and I'm expecting there to be a lot of questions, maybe concerns, the typical questions and concerns that people have about nuclear power. But overall, I think the community has become much more supportive and accepting of it. That being said, it's still not the mainstream solution. And I say that, for example, when the UNFCCC tweets out things about clean energy, it's always pictures of solar and wind, and not really anything else, when there's this whole suite of technologies that could really be used in this fight. And so I like projects like Nuclear Reimagined, for example, by Susie Baker, where she put out positive images of nuclear that could be used by these agencies, to include in their social media and the things that they're putting out about clean energy, that it's not just this small suite of technologies that we normally think of in clean energy, but that it's a much wider energy suite from that.
If you haven't already, listeners, you should go and listen to the episode that we did with Susie Baker about the Nuclear Reimagined campaign. On the one hand, it is a truly kind of beautiful and inspiring project, and it has been wonderful to see it in sort of media about advanced nuclear, obviously to see it at conferences and events and panels talking about the technology. On the other hand, it's so good. I would like to see sort of version 2 of it, and certainly you want to see more photographs of actual reactors operating in the world. Hopefully, sometime in the next few years, certainly over the next decade. So that's just a plug for our own show there, and for Susie's work. So Breakthrough has a report coming out in the next few months on opposition to nuclear in emerging economies. You just sort of suggested that there's still work to do in the clean tech community. I think there's work to do among the general public in rich, middle income and poor countries. sort of in preparation of hopefully a big new wave of advanced nuclear deployment over the next few decades. You have obviously spent most of your time working on the U.S. regulatory and business community. But you've also traveled to countries like Kenya. And I'm curious what your sense of the conversation around nuclear in emerging economies is, maybe in contrast to nuclear in the developed world.
Sure. So like you said, I was fortunate enough to travel to Kenya last year for a nuclear conference that covered the whole region. And I think it was important for me to go there because we have been saying that these new small modular reactors could be used for emerging economies and, in remote locations. But it's a different thing to actually go there and see what the issues are and talk to the people firsthand. And there's a few things that I learned. So you mentioned looking at anti-nuclear campaigns and sentiment in emerging economies. I think where a lot of that comes from is that people, much like in the US, want to have ownership over things and want to feel like they're involved in the technology process. So when they see that it's big governments, big foreign governments and state-owned entities coming in and investing and putting this big technology down, then I can see how that spurs anti-nuclear sentiment because it's not seen as something that they have ownership over. And so we've been trying to tell our story better, saying that even our first reactor is going to be owned by communities. And I think that's an important story to tell because it shows that, this is something that you can have ownership over. This is somewhere you can work and your family and friends can have jobs, and something that will have a lot of community input. So I think that's an important aspect. Another one is that you can't just invest in electricity in the area and expect that to be the end all. It's really, truly a cycle of economic development that needs to happen. In Kenya, we had the ability to go tour their new geothermal plant, and they have one of the largest geothermal resources in the world, and built this plant that has to run at half capacity at night because no one's buying the power. So there's this circle of economic development that needs to happen where you invest in some electricity infrastructure, and then there's further investment in industry to come in, then people get jobs in industry, then they can afford to buy more power from the plant. So it's really this cycle that needs to happen. And I think SMRs are in a good place to do that because you can incrementally add growth in the plan. So you can install first 60 megawatts and then another 60 and have that different installments in investment and then power being put out to enable that economic development cycle to happen.
We have a really similar sense of the sort of hesitancy or just outright opposition to advanced nuclear in emerging economies, which is that it is a little different than in rich countries, which have maybe a very strong environmental or civil society sort of legacy of anti-nuclear organizing that was born out of opposition to weapons or with a memory of things like Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, and we find sort of less of that in emerging economies and more of what you're describing, which is opposition to a sort of alien infrastructure deployment regime that is uninformed by the citizenry, uninformed by civil society, uninformed by the general public. So that is different. But what you're suggesting is that the solution is kind of the same in all contexts. That whether it's in Kenya or whether it's in Utah, we want to be involving communities from the get-go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, we've seen in terms of public engagement that just educating the public on nuclear technology or telling them about it doesn't really increase sympathy for the technology. People really need to be involved in the process of the entire life cycle of technology development, because then, for us as a technology developer, we know what's going to be really useful in the market if we know what people are looking for. And on the other hand, then they feel involved in the process. So I think that public engagement needs to happen on a much larger scale when we're developing these technologies.
You've been involved in advanced nuclear for, as you say, over a decade. What are some of the biggest things you've learned in that decade?
I think some of the biggest things I learned in the last decade of being in the nuclear industry, it kind of started actually before I graduated in nuclear engineering. I took a class on nuclear waste, and I thought, like all of our other classes, it was going to be technical, and we're going to learn about different types of waste and how it's taken care of and then disposed of. But in reality, the professor just talked to us about the different policies in place and how the public has responded to nuclear waste. And I think that's when it clicked with me. What I just described before is that you can design the perfect technology with the ultimate safety systems at the lowest cost. But if people don't accept it, or if you don't have the right policies in place, then that technology isn't going to go anywhere. And so that's why I like what I do now, because although I work for the technical company, I'm really working on that stakeholder engagement and making sure that we do it right this time around in nuclear.
Well, we're looking forward to seeing what doing it right this time around looks like. Lenka Kollar, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Breakthrough Dialogues. If you like our show, tell your friends, rate us, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or whatever platform you get your podcasts. I want to again thank my guest, Lenka Kollar, and our producers, Alyssa Kadaman and Tali Perlman. Catch you next time.